All right, we're good. David. Okay. All right.
There was the earlier slide.
Welcome. Hello. All right. Is the sound good? Are we even mic'd here? Do we need to be? Probably not. Yeah. Good and back. So welcome to the Roundtable on Teaching Race, an event in the Faculty Senate's week-long Teach In 2018, and this event sponsored along with the Faculty Senate sponsorship by the Wolf Humanities Center. I'm Jim English. I'm a professor in the English department, and I am the director of the Wolf Humanities Center. As soon as we learned about the plans for this teach-in from Santosh Venkatesh, who is the chair of the Senate and who came up with the idea of doing this, as we learned, we at the Wolf Center were eager to be involved. The Senate's aim in organizing Penn's first teach-in since 1969 was, quoting from their website, to emphasize the university's production, dissemination, and use of knowledge. That is basically the mission of the Wolf Center as pertains to the humanities and the humanistic social sciences. That's what we do every day, every year with our public programming around particular themes, this year Afterlives, and with our at-large events like this one. So we're very glad to be part of this enterprise. That previous teach-in back in 1969 was largely occasioned by the civil rights movement. It involved an important sit-in by black students and black community activists from West Philadelphia and elsewhere in the city. I don't have to tell you that the struggles over race, representation, and power in this country and around the world are still, 50 years later, ongoing and as urgent as ever. There are few, if any, topics more heatedly divisive of our society today than that of race. Universities have become a central target of the right-wing propaganda apparatus for ostensibly imposing a narrow regime of correct thinking on racial matters. That is a cynical mischaracterization of the work we do, but an influential one. So this morning, 4 members of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences will tell us how they actually approach race, first in their research and writing, and then in their classrooms. They will each speak briefly for less than 10 minutes, really just to introduce a few ideas so that in the remaining 45 or 50 minutes, they can converse with each other and with you in response to your comments and questions. I'm going to introduce each speaker individually so that you don't get a great block of introductory stuff and then forget who's who as they step up. So we're going to start with my good friend and colleague in the English department, David Eng. David is Richard L. Fisher Professor of English and Chair of Graduate Studies in the English department, as well as holding faculty positions in Asian American Studies, Comparative Literature and Literary Theory, and Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. David's work focuses on Asian American and Asian diasporic culture at the intersection of race studies, gender and sexuality studies, legal studies, and psychoanalytic theory. His books include the classic Racial Castration, Managing Masculinity in Asian America, The Feeling of Kinship, Queer Liberalism and the Racialization of Intimacy, and I think about to be published this year, co-authored with Shin-Hee Han, a dialogue of racial melancholia and racial dissociation. Please welcome David Eng.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks to Jim for organizing it, the panel, and for the other speakers. We have very little time, so I'm going to get right into it. I was taking Jim's mandate to talk a little bit about our scholarship and how that translates into the undergrad classroom. And I decided to talk to you today about one of the projects that I'm working on, racial melancholia and racial dissociation on the social and psychic lives of Asian Americans. And I decided to do that because actually this entire book comes from the undergraduate classroom and the clinic. As Jim said, I work broadly in law and in psychoanalysis. In fact, I'm in a psychoanalytic institute in New York. And I'll tell you a little bit about the background of this book. So for about 20 years, I've been writing with a friend of mine, Shinhee Han, psychoanalytic case histories and commentaries on Asian American undergraduates. And Shinhee and I met in my first teaching job. I was at Columbia back in the mid-90s, and she, in fact, was the only person of color working in counseling and psychological services. In our second year of my teaching, there was a spate of suicides by Asian American students. I was the only person working in the field. As I said, she was the only person of color in counseling psychological services. So we actually met under these very unfortunate circumstances. And we didn't know each other, but we started to write together literally as a way of trying to come to terms with the psychic pain that the students were experiencing. And in retrospect, what has happened over the last 20 years is that for me, the classroom, and for her, the clinic, have really been a kind of social barometer for measuring the changing patterns, social and psychic patterns, of immigration, racialization, and assimilation from Generation X to Generation Y, right? So in 20 years, we've actually moved from my generation to the millennials. So this is the table of contents of the book. And I wanted to walk you through it very quickly, and then to talk about the last chapter, which is on gay panic attack and colorblindness. So we started our work together by writing about racial melancholy, model minorities, depression, and suicide. And then about 15 years, like 5 years later, 15 years ago, whenever I taught my Asian American literature and culture classes, more and more of the students would start coming out to me, not as gay or lesbian, but as transnational adoptees. But the language that they used about their adoption was a language that was borrowed from queer studies. You know, I'm in the closet about being an adoptee, I feel a certain stigma and shame, I have to come out again and again. So it's a very, very interesting kind of crossing of transnational adoption, race, and sexuality studies. And so she and I wrote a series of case histories called Desegregating Love, Transnational Adoption, Racial Reparation, and Racial Transitional Objects. And then as we moved to more recent times, 10 years ago, when I arrived at Penn, I started to notice something that was really unusual, which is to say, in my generation, post-65, model minority, parents were immigrants, we were second generation, our elite education was our upward mobility. That's a second generation model. But what has happened under neoliberalism and the rise of Asia globally is that more and more of the students in my class are coming directly from Asia, they're parachute kids. So we've moved from a second generation to a first generation model. And so in the classroom, in Shinhee's clinic, more and more of the population were parachute kids. Actually, does everyone know that term?
No.
No. So who does know that term? So what is a parachute kid? Is that Lindsay?
Hello.
Lindsay! My long lost friend.
I'm so glad that this introduction will now be on camera forever. So a parachute kid is essentially someone who a lot of times was born in
Asia.
Asia, sorry. I woke up very early this morning.
Me too.
I'm lazy. They were born in Asia, and then they move and immigrate to the United States at a very young age, and essentially I'll oftentimes grow up and go to school here. A lot of times their parents are still in Asia, and they're kind of boarding their way on their own through the American school system. So that's why you might see a lot of, for example, boarding school applications rise. I went to a boarding school, so I saw that. And nowadays you also see a lot more families paying for entrance, essentially. For example, you can donate, I think it's $1 million, and have a business in the United States, and that'll offer you a permanent residence. And that's how sometimes parents will get their children to have school in the United States.
Thanks. So I only have 10 minutes, so that's it for the parachute kids. But these are kids often as young as 8 who immigrate on their own to Western-speaking nations for quote-unquote educational opportunities. But kids are sent away for all different reasons, including being gay. And so it's a fascinating kind of question. So Du Bois said, how does it feel to be a problem? And Asian model minorities are often, how does it feel to be a solution? But you have a whole group of students now coming from Asia, many of whom would not be able to survive in the competitive Asian school system, which is even more competitive than the United States, kind of being sent away under the cloud of how does it feel to be a problem. So that's just an example of the kind of shifting social landscape that gets us into this section on parachute kids. And then the last chapter, which I'm going to talk a little bit about now, is Gay Panic Attack, which is about coming out. This is a case histories of gay men who are coming to the West in part to search for sexual freedom. But I just wanted to make a few points before I move to that. The first is really the shift from Generation X to Generation Y, from a second generation model to a first generation model of immigration. The second thing I wanted to say is Shinhee and I loosely group these psychic paradigms of racial melancholia and racial dissociation with X and Y, and we talk about these as kind of psychic paradigms by which Asian American students process loss associated with immigration, racialization, and assimilation. And the last thing I'll say is I work broadly across law and psychoanalysis, and one way to think about the whole project is that we're really trying to explore the history of the racial subject. Psychoanalysis is the primary vocabulary for that, with the subject of racial history. And certainly as far as Asian Americans are concerned, law is the central mechanism of immigration and exclusion that has determined so much of the social lives of Asian Americans. Like Lindsay's example of just visa programs that are trying to bring in Asian capital, right? That you see this across not just universities now, but even public schools. There's a huge article in the New York Times a few months back about a school system in Michigan, public school system that was bringing in 200 parachute kids from China in order to balance their school budget. So the big question is, if Asian students are a paycheck for these different educational institutions, is there any sense that there are a group with special needs or any kind of special psychological questions? And you can even think about how difficult it is for an adult, a young adult. My parents came as grad students to immigrate on their own. What does it mean to immigrate on your own as an 8-year-old? What are the kind of psychological issues that are attached to that? And that really is where we get this idea of racial dissociation and psychic nowhere. So I'm going to spend the last few minutes talking about the last chapter, Gay Panic Attack. So this chapter is all about young men, very accomplished, highly educated, who go west in search for sexual freedom, however they define it. When they come here, they all suffer from panic attacks. All right, that's, in my generation, if you went to the clinic, it was about depression, you talked about race, you talked about homophobia. In this generation, everything, not just them, all students go in for panic attacks. When you ask the students to narrate the source of their pain, though sexual freedom is part of the story of their migration, questions of homophobia and questions of racism never come up in their account. And so this is why Shinhee and I called the chapter Gay Panic Attack, gay in parentheses. So the question really becomes, what is all the panic about then? And in some sense, the larger section of the book on racial dissociation, and the question that we're really trying to explore in this chapter is what's the psychic structure of colorblindness for millennials today? So let me talk just very quickly about dissociation. It's a concept that comes from Winnicott and from Bromberg. It's often traced to Freud's essays on Schreber and paranoia. This is 1911. In Freud's essays on paranoia, he says that hysteria condenses, right? So the hysterical symptom takes all your problems and it puts it into one object, like a cough, a tic, aphasia, and you have to unpack, right, that condensation. So he says hysteria condenses, but paranoia disperses. All right, and what he means for Freud, the paradigmatic paranoiac is the homosexual Dr. Schreber, who was a very, very accomplished German politician who had suffered a series of mental breakdowns. And Freud diagnoses him as a repressed homosexual, and he says in paranoia, what is repressed on the inside is disavowed and projected outward, right, into the wide social sphere, and it returns to the subject in an unrecognizable form. So you just think about, okay, I love him is disavowed and projected outward, and it returns as he hates me, right, or she loves him. So this is the way in which what is a kind of forbidden desire gets scattered into the social field and comes back to you in a way that you don't quite recognize. So in paranoia and in dissociation, what you get is no subject. All you get is a series of scattered objects. And this literally defines what a panic attack is, right? And a panic attack, it feels like you're dying, it feels like your body's in pieces, it's spread out all over the social field. And new technology today, like social media, new media, students, Generation Y, millennials, they're everywhere at once. They're in virtual space, they're in real space, they have an image here, they have an image there. Now, the important thing to remember about dissociation is that it's both healthy and unhealthy. So this is Bromberg's point that everybody dissociates. When you're in a stressful social situation, you often have to create, right, a kind of different or highlight a different aspect of your personality in order to function. So dissociation could be profoundly self-protective. But the difference between it being healthy or unhealthy is that for a healthy person, eventually they are able to create the illusion of a whole self from all of these pieces. And a person who cannot have a healthy way of dissociating is unable to do this. So another way of thinking about it is if it's healthy, you can reconcile the way that you see yourself with the way that other people see you. So now we're already on the terrain of the racial stereotype. Think about that. This has a lot to say about race because of the ways in which racial stereotypes make it impossible for certain people to see you the way that you see yourself. And here you can just go to a famous scene from Fanon's Black Skin, White Mass, where he walks into the movie theater, he's waiting for his stereotype to appear on the screen. It appears, he says, my body is shattered in 1,000 pieces, right? He's repelled by the images. People talk about that scene in terms of identification, they talk about it in terms of images, but it's also profoundly a spatialized scene of dissociation, where his body is all over the social space and it cannot be reassembled into one coherent image. So I'm going to end just by suggesting how this functions in relation to gay panic attack and the psychic mechanisms of colorblindness. Parachuting itself literally is sending young kids at very early age across the globe. And when you look at these case histories, what you see again and again is they have multiple diasporas. They go from Beijing to Singapore to Los Angeles to New York. They go from Bombay to Sydney, to Chicago, to New York. So there's already a literal kind of spatialized model that these young kids have to deal with about their body being in several places at once. But the mono-minority stereotype is built completely on the notion of compliance, that Asian Americans are compliant, they will not rock the boat, they're excellent students, they don't engage in social protest. So in fact, you have to think that the mono-minority stereotype itself, right, that you're self-reliant, that you can overcome social obstacles. I mean, this is the model minority is a social contract of colorblindness, right? To be a model minority is to sign up for colorblindness as a group. The paradox, of course, is that Asian Americans are always included in diversity statistics, but they're often not considered racialized. They're often thought about as suffering no discrimination. So, as Jim said, today, especially under our current administration, we live formally and legally in a colorblind world, but everywhere around us, we see increasing racial discord and racial violence. So I would suggest that in many ways, this kind of doubleness sends racism, it sends homophobia underground, right? It's become unconscious. At Penn, I'll end with an example from Penn. 20% of the undergraduate student body is Asian American, and 12% of the student body is foreign, half of whom come from India and China. So I'm not a mathematician, and I'm actually not that great at math, but that's 1/4, more than 1/4 of the student body is Asian or Asian American. In the English department where Jim and I teach, in the English department alone, we have 6 early modernists, we have 6 modernists, we have 4 faculty in 18th century studies, we have 5 faculty in African American studies. Yet in the entire university at Penn, there are 3 Asian Americanist faculty, me and my colleague Joe Park, and Ichiro Azuma in history. In any liberal democratic system, this disparity in representation would be intolerable. However, when it comes to Asian Americans, it's perfectly acceptable. This is just the status quo. And in this sense, all of us, not just Asian Americans, are racially dissociated in a colorblind world. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, David. So we're off to a good start. Our next speaker is Susan Lindy. Professor Lindy is the Janice and Julian Bears Professor and Chair of the Department in the History and Sociology of Science Department. Susan's also a former Associate Dean of the Social Sciences in SAS. She's done much good and heavy service for the school and the university. She's published widely and influentially on nuclear science, on World War II and Cold War science. Her first book, Suffering Made Real, was a study of American science and survivors of Hiroshima. But much of her work has focused on the human genome in its social, cultural, and political dimensions. Her books in this area include Moments of Truth in Genetic Medicine, published in 2005, and The DNA Mystique, the Gene as a Cultural Icon, co-authored with Dorothy Nelkin. So welcome Susan Lindy, please.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you to everybody who's here. It's a really wonderful opportunity to talk about what our faculty are up to and the kinds of problems we look at. I am going to tell you a little bit. I see myself primarily as a historian of genetics, and genetics is a really important way to think about race, heredity, identity, social order. It's a place where. Can you tell me how to get my?
Yeah, can you get that stuff?
That would be great. Thank you so much. Sorry for my inability. So I have more slides that I'm actually going to talk about. But Sebastian, who's my colleague, and we both teach about questions of race and identity and the history of the way that technical expertise has been brought to bear on these questions. From my perspective, the key thing about teaching race is similar to the way that I teach gender. I see it as a way to think about how power works. And what it permits you to see is what are the institutions, what are the protocols, what is the logic through which social order is produced and sustained? How do you keep it going? There are 3 categories that I think about. One is what we call capillary power. That is, power works through very subtle interactions. It sometimes operates without people thinking too much about it. It has tremendous force in everyday life. Through, certainly with race, hierarchies, very strict hierarchies. These are systems that often have rules about who's at the top and who's at the bottom, and rules for deciding what category people belong in. This is definitely true for gender. Gender is a very powerful organizing category for social life. It's true for race as well. And then also something that it's hegemonic power, and my meaning for that is that it's power that is internally performed. That is, people adopt identities, and this actually part of what David was talking about. They occupy social locations that matter for them. Now, historically, scientists have been important parts of race, the races of man. This is an ongoing debate for about 500 years. There's a huge scientific literature. One of the things that historians of science are concerned with is how ideas about race were taken up in technical systems. and how they reflected relationships between European explorers. So in the age of discovery, part of what happens for Europe is that people all over the world become the focus of studies of brains, skin, hair, but also, I want to emphasize, tangled up with these biological or physical properties, ideas about language, culture, religion, marriage, and morality, and most of all, the key category is civilization. So civilization gets written as a part of racial identity, and that's a huge element in this European debate about race and how it works. I want to suggest, oh, that's my cute dog slide. I want to suggest I want to make the point that all of these divisions, that is, I've talked about hierarchies, capillary knowledge, hegemonic knowledge, all of these divisions and identities are socially negotiated. They differ over time, they differ by place, they have different rules, and they are, so they're not historically solid, they're not stable, and they're also not consistent across regions, across different systems. They don't work the same way everywhere. And I emphasize this because I'm going to turn in a minute to questions of biology. We can assume that human biology is more or less has been pretty consistent 2 million years. And so given the extreme variation in the understanding of what counts as a racial category or racial identity and different practices for managing race, I want to suggest that it's not necessarily about biology. There's a lot of other things going on. So it's a very powerful idea and it matters for human history, but the tendency to track it to a certain biological identity or cause is something that I would say whenever you see a powerful hierarchical social system, whenever you see biology invoked to explain it, what you ought to have is a tiny bit of skepticism, a tiny bit of why is that so conducive, why is that such a perfect match between the social order and human biology, and obviously partly that is why is the social order, perfectly hierarchical in ways that then biology finds that hierarchy. So I would say that one might be especially skeptical about such categories when there is such a powerful capital impulse to sustaining the categories. And this is a picture of a cute German shepherd named Tracker, but this is several copies of him. So dogs began to be cloned in 2009, and this is a practice of the capitalist investment in what we might call purity, pure lines, biology as an explanation for personality. Dogs are a very important surrogate for human beings. When we talk about human behavior, we often turn to animals in general, and this is also a capitalist product. It's something you can buy. Not that any of us would ever buy a cloned dog. But there's also a huge capital an industry built around biogeographical ancestry testing, and this is 23andMe, and these are these companies that will sell you a DNA test that will tell you where you really come from or who you really are, supposedly. And of course, family tree DNA and mixed breed dog testing. So one of the things I'm interested in, and some of the questions I ask are, how is race today both rejected and embraced at the same time? There are systems where people say race doesn't matter, race is not biologically real, but race is also very, very important. So it's that simultaneous rejection and embracing that is interesting. How do ideas about race and genetics solve problems? So that's another question to ask when you see biology invoked to explain a social pattern or a social system or a hierarchy. Ask yourself, how does that biology solve a problem for whoever is engaged in using it? What problem does it solve? One example is the connection between indigeneity and states all over the world. How are the indigenous and indigenous biology invoked to solve problems of citizenship and national identity? whose bodies have testified to the reality of race, so including tracker. In other words, how do dogs and people and indigenous groups and different racial groups serve to testify to how powerful this, important this idea is? And also, how can we think clearly about such a pervasive and powerful hierarchy and system? Now, what is race? And I'm going to suggest that it's a bunch of different things. But one is it's a patenting strategy. So for Bidil, for example, it became, the reason that Bidil was identified as an African-American drug is that that permitted the company to patent it separately in a different way. It was already in use as a pharmaceutical, and calling it, having a different meaning, meant that you could claim it as territory, capital. It is an OMB, it's also an Office of the Management and Budget Classification, so racial identity matters for how the government is run. It's an FDA drug category, so when the FDA talks about how drugs have to be tested, they specify that they have to be tested in certain kinds of populations. These are institutional, remember I said you ask, what are the institutions that sustain the idea of race and that keep it going? It is now an NIH required category for inclusion, so if you want to get money from the NIH, you have to show that you are engaging with a certain mixture of persons who identify as particular races. And then this is my example. This is the Human Identity Project team in 2005. And what's fascinating about this is this intersection of incredible technical data. So this was an application that had many, many pages of details on what these technical protocols would be for studying these materials, but they were self-identified ethnicities. And it kind of, it relates to this question. So you've got to be, you understand that self-identity for race is plastic, and it depends on time and place and how you understand yourself. And you know about the one drop rule, which is that in the American system, someone who has, quote, one drop of African blood is African American. So it's an incredibly detailed technical account and a casual, even perfunctory approach to racial identity or racial marking, so making it obvious and uncomplicated. There are other things that race is. It is obvious at a moment's glance. So in the clinic, do you instantly know what someone's health risks are when they walk in the door because of this marking? Do you know what my health risks are because I'm a white female? Do you know what anybody's risks are based on that instantaneous blink perspective of their body, their risk, their genetics, their heredity, all those things together? It is self-identified. So the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, for example, if we wish to recognize employees as having a particular racial identity, they decide what that is. That's how they enter that category. We don't put people into categories. They decide who they are. It's a census category. This is OMB. These are, I love these this broad mix of categories. So the grand scheme is Asian, and I'm sure that David would agree with me that that's a pretty broad and complicated category. Black or African American, Hispanic, Native Hawaiian, white, and white is an incredibly complicated category too. None of these are so simple as they might seem. So this is how the OMB thinks about race. This is family tree DNA. I don't know how many of you have done this DNA testing or how much importance you've given it in your sense of your own identity, but many people have. It's almost a hobby. We call it genotainment. It's for fun, and it's not necessarily taken as a serious technical details, but you see this is human migration haplogroups, and so it's a story about race. It's a story about human origins. So it's a census category. It's also social consensus. It is a forensic guide, and in forensic DNA, the ways the categories are similarly reduced. They are white, Asian, Hispanic, African. These are these broad categories. It's a surrogate for socioeconomic status in many cases. It's seen as standing in for other kinds of capital and questions of capital. And in 1951, the UNESCO race statements, and I'm hoping Sebastian might talk more about this, but in 1951, the UNESCO race statement, which was a consensus conclusion based on the latest scientific data, said that race does not exist. It is now 2018, and as far as I can tell, it still exists. It's an incredibly powerful idea. It's had huge consequences, and part of what I do when I teach is to try to give students the tools they need to think critically about these kinds of power structures, what they mean for them every single day, how they play out in so many interactions, both subtle and dramatic, and sometimes violent, and sometimes emotional, and sometimes really in the nitty-gritty fine details of human interaction that matter so much. So, thank you.
Thank you, Susan. As Susan alluded to, our next speaker is Sebastian Hirviano, her colleague in the History and Sociology of Science department. Sebastian is comparatively new to Penn. He joined our faculty 2 years ago, having arrived from a postdoctoral fellowship in race and ethnicity in the Global South at the University of Sydney. His research focuses on the history of scientific racial concepts and theories since 1900, with particular focus on Latin America and the Global South. His research projects pursue fundamental questions raised by global histories of science. These questions include: how are scientific conceptions of human diversity produced? How are they challenged? And how has the concept of race served simultaneously as a stimulus and a deterrent to the production of new knowledge? I'll leave it off there and turn things over to Sebastian.
Okay, so thank you so much, all of you, for being here early on a Monday morning, and thank you to the organizers. And thank you to David and Susan, because you've, in some sense, made my task easier. You've already sort of set the stage for me for a lot of what I want to say. So hopefully that means I can keep my remarks relatively short, and we can, so that we can open things up for discussion. So I work at the intersection of the history of the human sciences and the life sciences. And I'm particularly interested in the history of anti-racism in science, and I address this from global and transnational perspectives. So I'm particularly interested in the period before and after the Second World War, so the decades immediately before and after the Second World War. And this is a really important period in thinking about kind of the conceptual history of race and science, because it's a period when scientists throughout the world and across a wide range of disciplines begin to question the conceptual validity of race and begin to introduce arguments that it has no scientific basis and is largely a made-up way of classifying people into unwarranted hierarchies. So Susan already gave us an example of this kind of project when she alluded to the UNESCO statements on race. So these were statements that were published in 1950 and 1951, and which declared that race is a social myth, that it doesn't exist. It's a sort of a made-up concept. And this is a strategy, an ostensibly anti-racist strategy that has persisted in science. And you know, the latest example of this is a very recent one. I don't know if anybody's seen the latest issue of National Geographic. It's very much similarly rehearsing this argument that race has no genetic or scientific basis. And there's something really funny about these arguments, because you know, in order to kind of declare that race doesn't exist and has no scientific basis, you inevitably end up having to talk about race and kind of re-inscribe it and re-rehearse it. So in my research, what I seek to do and what I'm really interested in is how this critique of race, this attempt to kind of expunge race from the study of science, also has a kind of politics. So I'm particularly interested in how scientists who were involved with these sort of mid-20th century critiques were trained in European institutions that were devoted to using science to better manage colonized groups, but also it was also a project driven by scientists who came from places like South America and the South Pacific, who were seeking to modernize their societies. So part of what I'm interested in showing in my research is that these critiques of the biological or genetic basis of race often facilitate a kind of politics that's about the supposed improvement and often assimilation of racial groups that get deemed backwards or underdeveloped. So I'm particularly interested in how these kinds of anti-racist critiques of kind of the conceptual basis of race grant moral authority to projects that are very much concerned with dismantling the ways of life of indigenous groups. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity to speak to you, and what I've decided to do is to take this opportunity to think about how the work I do in my research, how it's translated into the classroom and the kind of principles that are underpinning it. So what I want to do with my remaining time is to briefly describe two of the principles that I see as sort of guiding my research and teaching practice. So the first I've already hinted to, it's this idea that anti-racism itself has a history and a politics, and that it's just as important to kind of teach the history of anti-racism in science as it is to teach the history of race in science. So a lot of the work that we as historians of science have done is to focus on the role that science has played in constructing conceptions of race and legitimating racist projects. And you saw several examples in Susan's presentation. But it's only more recently that historians of science have begun paying more attention to how people have contested these kinds of ideas and how scientists have attempted to kind of distance themselves from the kind of ideological baggage of race science and how they've sort of attempted to construct anti-racist conceptions. So both in my research and teaching, I emphasize the importance of examining the history and politics of anti-racism in the same way and with the same rigor that we examine the history and politics of racism in science. And I just want to give you an example of this, and this is something that came up in one of the classes I'm teaching this semester on race and gender in the history of science. So in this class, one of the texts that I teach, and this is a primary source, is a text written by Frederick Douglass called "The Claims of the Negro Ethnologically Considered." So this was actually a commencement address in 1854, and it's an address given by Frederick Douglass, who was a former slave and a pioneering figure in the abolitionist movement. And what's really fascinating about this text is that, even though Douglass didn't have a sort of formal training in science or anthropology or kind of the sciences of the day, he engages in a really thorough and sort of powerful critique of the existing scientific theories, which claimed that the different races represent should be ranked hierarchically, that different races should be classified as different species even, and that acted as a kind of legitimation of slavery. So it's really important, I think, to teach these kinds of texts where we see people engaging and contesting with the sort of the racial ideologies of the day, and Douglass engages quite carefully with the science and introduces a series of arguments about how the sort of degrading conditions and environment of slavery produces bodies that can be described through the idioms of racial science. So this is, I think, a really important way of getting at how there is also kind of a history of anti-racism in science, a history of kind of contesting the sort of racial sciences that we've been talking about already. But this year when I taught this text, one of my students pointed out that Douglass's speech, Douglass's text also describes Native Americans as a weak race that's sort of destined to die off. And so this led to a really interesting discussion about how the text also ends up crafting an argument about how indigenous peoples are sort of inevitably destined to kind of fade away. So this leads to the second point, the sort of second principle I emphasize in my teaching, and that's the importance of indigenous perspectives. So in my own teaching, I'm really concerned with centering questions of indigeneity, and I do this by beginning my accounts of the rise of sort of scientific thinking about race with the early modern period and the sort of the first colonization of the Americas. And one of the things that we see in this period, in the early modern period, when the first European settlers arrive in the Americas, is that they begin to think about and conceptualize the difference between Amerindian bodies and European bodies. And already in this moment, we begin to see the beginnings of a discourse which assumes that indigenous peoples are weaker, that they're, I mean, in the early modern context, they were described as sort of phlegmatic, as having sort of a weaker complexion and constitution, and that it was therefore inevitable that they would sort of die from disease. So I think it's really important to teach this perspective on race because you know, it points to a different way of thinking about the stakes of the way we think and talk about racial diversity and inclusion. So, you know, as you know, we saw in the previous presentations, questions and discussions of racial diversity and inclusion are often framed around the question of how to recognize and respect differences and how to address the structural barriers that act as impediments to the inclusion of different racial groups. So what sort of gets taken for granted sometimes in conversations around racial diversity and inclusion is the notion that you know, that the politics of diversity and inclusion should, that the politics of diversity should be about inclusion. So the reason I mention this is because recent work by indigenous scholars has attempted to kind of unsettle and problematize this idea of inclusion, and has done so by engaging in what indigenous scholars have called a politics of refusal. So really interesting work done by an indigenous anthropologist such as Audra Simpson and Kim Tallbear have raised arguments about sort of the limits of social science inquiry, and have you know, argued that in order to maintain indigenous sovereignty, it's really important to kind of place limits on what social scientists can know about indigenous peoples, what is revealed about indigenous peoples. This sort of politics of refusal also comes up in the context of DNA testing, where indigenous scholars have you know, really sort of questioned the validity of DNA testing as a way of defining their identity, and you know, pointed out that there are existing practices, tribal practices for determining citizenship and who gets to belong to different Native American tribes. And the reason why indigenous peoples have opted, or indigenous scholars in particular have opted for this sort of tactic of refusal, is because they see the question of diversity as having a different set of stakes, that it's about maintaining territorial sovereignty, that it's about you know, maintaining their historical attachments to land. So it's not necessarily about being included in what they see as a settler colonial state. So you know, this I bring this up because this is something that I find quite tricky and quite challenging to teach in the classroom. I think we're all quite habituated to kind of thinking about questions of diversity as kind of questions of multiculturalism and inclusion, and it's much harder to kind of think about how some groups might want to kind of refuse these kinds of gestures, and there are also ones in which we're implicated, right? From indigenous perspectives, we're seen as settlers and therefore kind of participants in the settler colonial state. So this is just so those are kind of the two sort of overarching principles that I've been using a lot in my research and teaching. I hope they can offer some productive discussion points, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what people have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Sebastian. Sarah, can you just get the next one? Quayshawn, I think it's just one slide, right?
No, it's a couple slides.
Oh, couple slides, okay. Our last speaker is Quayshawn Spencer. Quayshawn has been an assistant professor in the philosophy department for 3 years, 4 years. He came after receiving a PhD in philosophy from Stanford and teaching at Stanford as well as at MIT, at University of San Francisco, and possibly elsewhere. He also holds a master's degree, a master's of science degree in biology, isn't that right? And also from Stanford. So he's an analytic philosopher with particular specialization in the philosophy of science, more particularly still the philosophy of biology and the philosophy of race. His writings are on the metaphysics of race, the nature of biological populations, the ontology of what philosophers call natural kinds, and what he terms, at least I think this is your term, Quayshawn, racial realism. So Quayshawn Spencer.
All right, good morning, and thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you so much to the previous speakers for really setting the standards high. So I'm going to give an introduction to my research and talk a bit about how I incorporate my research into my teaching. Just take about 5-10 minutes. So, as Professor English said, I do philosophy of race. I do it from an analytic tradition, which means we focus a lot on language and logic. So we really try to get it, what do people mean when they say such and such, right? So the sort of question that your toddler would throw at you, it really annoys you. They grow up and they get jobs. They become analytic philosophers, right? And we also focus on the really sort of logical basis of the arguments people provide for their views. So this is part of the philosophy of race, the metaphysics and epistemology side. Metaphysics is a fancy term for the study of reality. Epistemology is a fancy term for the study of knowledge. And these are the sorts of questions that we try to address in the metaphysical and epistemological side of philosophy of race. What is a race, right? What are we talking about, right? What makes a group of people a race? What makes a person a member of a race? These can have different answers. Is race real? Like, you can acknowledge that race is such and such, but then reject that there are any such things as races, that race exists at all. If it is real, is it biologically real, or does it have some other kind of reality? And then some more practical questions. Is there any racial classification that's a reliable proxy for, say, human genetic diversity in medical research that has a lot of downstream importance in School of Medicine, let's say? And then, some of the more touchier stuff, an epistemological question is there any good evidence that any race is different in socially important traits like intelligence, criminal behavior, and so forth? Right? Now, on the other side, philosophers of race also delve into moral and political, lots of moral and political questions that one can raise about race. So remember, on the previous slide, we asked, what is race? Well, then there's a moral question about how should we define race? Right? This is actually a question that our federal government engages in every 20 or so years that Professor Lindy pointed out. But this is essentially a normative question. This is a question about how we should do something in our daily lives. And then, of course, we delve into what is racism. And believe it or not all philosophers of race are on board with the idea of institutional racism. So we argue about things that are taken to be no-brainers among a lot of other academics. I didn't mean to call us as having no brains, but in any case, we really try to delve into these questions at their basic levels. Is there anything distinctively morally wrong about racism? That's something that has gotten a lot of attention in recent years. And then some, again, practical, like more narrow questions. Can reparations for blacks be morally justified? If so, how? Can race-targeted preferential affirmative action be morally justified? If so, how? And some more recent stuff, some philosophy of language type stuff. What makes a racial epithet morally objectionable, right? We all avoid saying the N-word. Why are we avoiding it, right? I'm not trying to promote it, but these are sorts of things that we dig into that you might think are no-brainers, but again, they have very complicated answers. So my research primarily focused on metaphysical and epistemological questions. These sorts of issues here, like what is a race, it's something I've spent a lot of time working on. Membership conditions for being in a race, reality of race, is race biologically real? I spent a lot of time working on that. I've just recently jumped into how racial research might be plausibly included in medical genetics, and something else I've spent some time on is there any connection between socially important traits? And I've delved into a little bit of the more normative stuff recently with looking at affirmative action questions. So instead of going into any particular research project, any paper or book that I've had, I thought I'd throw out an example of the sorts of problems that philosophers of race are trying to handle, especially on the metaphysical side. So let's take this question, what makes a group of people a race? Is this, according to an American English sort of perspective, a sample of black race? Who says yes? I see some hands raised, I don't have any. All right? So the fact that you gave an answer tells me that you think that there's some criteria for visible physical features as being relevant to racial classification, right? This is by no means a popular view in philosophy of race, but for those who believe that, they do argue that yes, this would be a decent sample of the black race. But then there are philosophers who think, no, you need to tell me something about ancestry. So actually, I've learned not to make these sort of quick judgments because these individuals over here are actually Melanesian, these individuals over here are actually sub-Saharan African. So these individuals over here have very distant ancestry to Africa, just about as much as Europeans. All right? So if you thought that ancestry had anything to do with racial membership, you would be mistaken to group all these people together, right? So these are kind of complex problems. Now, you could think, well, I don't really care about any biological facts. I want to know about how they're treated in society. So this is a big group of philosophers of race. They think that there's inherently something political, although also there's a sort of cultural, there's other social facts that might be relevant for making this decision. But this is a particular example. You might think that biological facts are completely irrelevant. They're just sort of red herrings with respect to what makes a group of people a race. It's really about how you're treated in society, right? So if the answer is yes, it's like, well, if individuals over here are pulled over by the cops, they're not going to ask for your 23andMe data, right? You're going to say, look, you look like these people over here, get on the ground, right? So that's another way of thinking about how to classify people into the black race. But then you can come back and say, well, what about self-identification? And I'm glad that Professor Lindy went through all these different complicated ways that we talk about race in the U.S. Some philosophers think that when you bring self-identification to the picture, now again, we can't say that all these people belong to the same race. And in fact, we have about 1.2 million self-identified Pacific Islanders in the United States. So these individuals definitely would reject being considered to be black. Right? So what do we do with that? Now, how I get in the picture is I think philosophers are sometimes right, sometimes wrong about this. I think that there's a radical polysemous character to the way that we use the term race when we're classifying people in groups. I'm working on a book, a monograph, a couple books, but one single author monograph, another multi-authored book that tries to make the case that in certain contexts, right, we use the term race in different ways, and there's no sort of overall theory that one can come up with to capture all the ways that we talk about race. All right. So how do I incorporate my research into my teaching? Well, primarily I teach philosophy of race courses, right? So that's kind of why I was hired. I could bring this sort of element to the philosophy department I've developed 3 philosophy of race courses. One, Philosophy 291. It's an undergraduate course where we start with some historical biological views of race from 1684 all the way up to contemporary views of race in philosophy of race. And we don't just do sort of metaphysics epistemology stuff. We do the normative stuff too. We talk about theories of racism. And then we have a rotating topic of either affirmative action, reparations, something like that. It's a primarily undergraduate level course. I've also developed a graduate level course, Race and Biology. We delve pretty much just exclusively into biological theories of race developed by anthropologists, biologists, and philosophers throughout the years. And we delve into the difficult epistemological and metaphysical questions. If you really wanted to know how to appropriately interpret a 23andMe test, this would be your course, because we take apart the test. The test is actually required in the course. There's certain ways to waive it, but then we sort of dig into exactly how you would reconstruct the results that you get from the test, right? So I actually want the calculations from the students to be able to recreate. They might be taking people's jobs away in the Bay Area, I'm not sure, but that's at sort of how deep we get into this biology. And then we wrap up the course with some discussions about what can we do with race in medicine. The last course I recently developed, it's gotten a lot of rave reviews from undergraduates, is affirmative action course. So we start in the 1970s when a lot of legislation and legal sort of movements were coming up, defending affirmative action in higher education, and we looked at all the Supreme Court decisions, U.S. Supreme Court, California Supreme Court, that have to do with this practice. Then we look at the philosophical justifications that one can come up with for and against the practice. It's quite controversial in philosophy. And the argument that has survived in U.S. Supreme Court is something that we look at in great depth. So that's pretty much what I do. Hopefully this will generate a lot of discussion, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Quayshawn, and all 4 panelists are going to come up here, so you could stay right here, Quayshawn, and we will, maybe we could turn the projector off so the light's not shining in anyone's face. We've gone predictably a little over our expected time, so I'm Sebastian up here. I'm going to forego my opportunity to respond to these diverse and really interesting talks and proceed directly to questions and comments from you guys. We have about 25 minutes, so I'd like to open it up to the audience. Anybody want to start us off over here?
Thank you very much for coming today. A really quick question, kind of deriving from Professor Amy Wax, and I think there's a lot.
Maybe a little louder because.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think I have a little question on Professor Amy Wax and the perspective professors should take on race, or set a base for should university limit the perspective professors should take on race, and should the university limit the education part, how professors should educate their students about race. Thank you very much.
Professor Amy Wax in the Penn Law School, who's recently been much in the news locally and nationally for controversial remarks she's made about differential abilities between black students and other students at Penn Law. Does anyone want to comment on that? Is Amy here? Professor Wax? I doubt it. Anyone want to field that question? The question.
I'll say one thing, Jim.
Yeah.
Which is you started with a statement about the kinds of stereotypes that adhere to the liberal university. I think the example that you raise about Professor Wax really underscores to us the fact that the university space is no more, no less racialized or segregated than other parts of U.S. society. I'll give you a quick example of this. When I started working with Shinhee in this project, I used to kind of idealize the clinic. And I would often say to her, what's the solution? What's the cure? And she always said to me, oh, you fool, there's no cure. The clinic is just as segregated as any other space. And she gave me this example. She said, from 1 to 10, the average student, white student, 10 being crisis, will come to the clinic at a 6. She said the average Asian American student will not come to the clinic until he or she's a 10 or 11, meaning that at that point they're already beyond crisis, and it's just her job, to expel the student because they're a liability. But she said the average African American student won't even come to the clinic, right? So there is a real example of the ways in which what we imagine to be a multicultural place of inclusion and diversity is no better, no worse than the rest of the world.
I'll say a little something in response to that too. Since I teach at affirmative action class, and her most controversial remarks were about not seeing enough African Americans in the law school, like the top quarter, I believe it was, of law school. That was a claim about seeing, so maybe she needs to look a little bit more careful. But in any case, I think that it's appropriate to talk about those things. People believe these things, of course. So if you can't talk about these things in a university setting, where can you talk about them? So what I do in my affirmative action course, look, of course, people have these stereotypes, we have these beliefs about how the acceptance happens in graduate and law school and undergraduate programs. So let's look at critically what's actually going on, right? And what people end up seeing is, to whatever extent things seem to be controversial in favor of African Americans, there are all these sort of subtle advantages for non-African American and white Americans in particular that just went without scrutiny. Why weren't we talking about those, right? And so then you could see when you really dig into things. I'm not scared to dig into things because I'm not particularly convinced that I'm going to find anything that's reinforcing the stereotype, right? It's usually based on pretty weak reasoning. And when you put that sort of to some real philosophical scrutiny, you can see what sort of problems rise to the fore. And students are smart enough to deal with that. If it's in a classroom setting, you read the literature from scholars, read the pros and cons. That's perfectly appropriate, I think.
I'm going to just mention resentfully Larry Summers' comments about women scientists, and just to validate that the expectations and assumptions about biological difference, intellectual difference, achievement difference those assumptions are all over. They're not unique to Penn. They're not unique in any social setting, and it's a sense of awareness of how powerful they are and what consequences they have. Larry Summers was not removed from his position as the president of Harvard University at that moment, even though that would have been my personal choice. So how do institutions come to terms with the performance of these assumptions? Yeah.
And I'll add one thing. I think, in some ways, Professor Wax's comments provide a really teachable moment as well. I'm thinking particularly of the original op-ed piece, which was very much framed in kind of cultural terms, civilizational terms, which, Professor Lindy has always been kind of one of the key stakes of kind of racial science. So, for somebody who works on the history of the social sciences, the kinds of arguments that were made about culture and kind of about the superiority of some cultures over others, to me, they very much echoed the kinds of arguments that social scientists made in the 1950s about cultures of poverty and so on and so forth. So I think there's a history of that kind of argumentation that we can teach, and we can help to kind of that helps us to kind of situate where they come from.
So I just want to make a comment that I do agree that if you can't talk about it in a university setting, where can you talk about it, especially when you have parameters and you research and good debate on topics. However, do you find, or this is a recent article, but with the Harvard one as well, do you find that intimidates African American students Or do they feel like, why should I go there if this, especially first year students, which now she's not teaching first year anymore, would that intimidate them? Would they say, I prefer to go to another university where I don't have that additional obstacle? And same for Harvard as well. Do you find, or do you think, I mean, logically, I would think, or does it make them rise to the challenge and say, I dare you to say that about me, let me show you?
Yeah, that's a good question. What are our duties, our responsibilities as ethical educators to our students? That's right.
I think that what Gil said about this is a very teachable moment. It's also a very blatant example. And I think the key issue is that focusing it on one person should not come at the expense of focusing on it as a structural and an institutional problem, which is the ways in which university settings or all settings actually facilitate a kind of perpetuation of what Cheryl Harris, the critical race scholar, would call whiteness as property. So I think that today, especially because of the kind of overloaded racial politics that we get that are focused on particular figures, that's often a distraction to the continuing structural inequalities. And the fact that diversity, in fact, has decreased, not increased, in the university around African Americans.
Yeah, I'll say one thing in addition. Unfortunately, even if it's not voiced explicitly, it's not like African American students not going to find that at whatever school they go to. If it's the same sort of caliber as Penn's law school, it's going to be there, right? It's just a matter of, well, is it as visible as it happens to be this particular campus? I'm a bit more concerned with students who are already here, already made the decision to matriculate, who have already been here, and how they experience the rest of their time here, given that she's on campus, or people. This is just an example. Individuals like that might be on campus teaching courses. I think the move to remove the individual from teaching incoming students was a good move. Perhaps administrators can think about other moves to make in that regard.
Over here, yeah.
So I have a question about teaching in particular. So how do you unsettle these ideas about race that are so loaded right now and so rooted in emotion, really? How do you combat that with reason without reinstating this sort of idea of like reason as the only way to get to knowledge, which I think specifically goes to your works, Sebastian?
That's your question.
It can be on everyone else's as well. Yeah.
Anyone? Yeah.
I mean, I thought, David's presentation did a really nice job of unpacking that, right? This how the kind of disconnect that you get between the ways in which the racial stereotypes that circulate produce certain kinds of subjectivity and the kinds of trauma and suffering that those can produce. So, I mean, I think it's also just important to acknowledge the ways in which we've been hurt and damaged by racial stereotypes and have that on the table.
I also think history is a very powerful way to ask those kinds of questions, because one thing it teaches you is the many different ways that people have, the many kinds of structures and forms of logic. And it's not just history is not a story of high reason. Okay, history is a story of unreason, of violence, of cruelty, of injustice. Those are the dominant themes in human history. So you can say science is a part of that story, but and technical reason is a part of that story, but it doesn't solve this problem because it's the historical problem. I think of race as, I mean, I'm a historian. I think of race as entirely historical, and it's a product of history. So if you understand the process, you understand some important things about it.
I very much agree with Sebastian and Susan. I think that, Susan, you kept on bringing up the issue of a story. And no matter what discipline we're talking about, race comes out as a story. In literature, where Jim and I are located, What I find unique about that genre is that unlike other fields, something like law, which has a whole repressive apparatus attached to it, literature really is, this is Gayatri Spivak's saying, right? It's the uncoercive rearrangement of desires. And so there is something about each of our disciplines that opens up into the difficulties that you're talking about, but actually provide the possibility of that uncoercive rearrangement of desires.
I add a little structural comment to this too, because there's a way that you can set up a course that can foster a good learning environment for talking about highly controversial topics like race. So I teach race only sort of in a seminar setting. I don't want like 100 students, people don't know each other, people start, biting each other's heads off. So like 15 students, they get to know each other quite well. Typically before the course ends, people are so comfortable, they're sharing all kinds of things. Oh yeah, by the way, I'm gay. Whoa, that wasn't the topic, right? But if you can get that comfortable around a group of individuals, you're in this project, this journey of trying to ask these deep questions, and you understand that the people who are together with you in this journey have the same goals, no ill will. And I also try to stack the more controversial stuff towards the end of the course, so that students who might, think, oh, this isn't for me, I'm not really committed to this, they drop out by the time we get to, say, racism. Racism is the second half of the course. We don't touch that in the first half of the course. So there are structural things you can also do in the lesson plan to minimize the sorts of concerns that you have.
Yes, here in front.
Well, I have basically two questions or concerns or even comments. Is that you presented your research in terms of your interests, but you implied the biases or the characteristics of the psyche or what we've been grown to accept as truth. So what is in your teaching process, what is your major objective? Is it to change attitudes? Is it to bring out attitudes? Is it to develop a model that can change psyche, biases, intentions, and things like that, that may tend to improve, let's say, the general feelings of America or in America?
Yes.
Those are ambitious goals for a teacher. Anyone want to speak to that? Like,
One class is not going to do that, but yes.
So what I try to do is, I'm not particularly engaged in any overarching project, because anyone who's raised children, the minute you show your cards, what you're trying to get them to do, they try not to do that. Right? So what I try to do is more the sort of Socratic method, raising questions, getting them to see their own ignorance, right? Because people tend to walk into my courses thinking they're the expert on race. I know what race is, I know what racism is. And especially individuals who have powerful experiences. A lot of African American students come to my course. I'm going to tear this course up. It's like, not necessarily, right? So sit back, listen, be humble, do the reading, engage deeply, and by the end of the course, people typically change their mind on something that they claim that they would never change their mind on, right? So someone's a staunch social constructionist, they come out the course a biological realist. Someone's a staunch biological realist, come out the course social constructionist, right? And I'm not keeping score or tallying or anything like that. It's just a matter of just trying to get them to do a lot of what I think ordinary Americans should do more. Be humble, be self-reflective and critical of your own beliefs, not think you have the answer to everything, and read and think and watch yourself grow.
I think the immediate answer is yes, but I do also want to emphasize that the cure is a collective cure. Right, so that the cure is in the clinic, it's in all of our classrooms, it's in community-based organizations. So, I'm not saying that this is the only, but it's one of I think, especially in a time of colorblindness and unconscious racism, of trigger warnings, it's one of the vocabularies that we need to discuss the kind of bifurcation, the kind of splitting that we see about race relations today.
In back, we have a question back there. I can only see the hand. Maybe you can stand up.
Sure. Kind of a related question. It seems like one of the major critiques of how academia approaches race is a political critique, that academia is incredibly liberal and we're indoctrinating our students with these ideas of political correctness, affirmative action, of how we want students to think about race. And And related to this question, I wonder how you guys approach that critique. Are you in the business of teaching people how to think, of changing minds? Or how do you argue that we're here to approach truth, we're here to approach knowledge, and that's our job in the classroom, our research?
I can take that. Definitely more in the latter category in the sorts of courses that I teach. And the way I try to enforce that is through the assessment, the writing essays, and it's sort of kind of exaggeration of analytic philosophical style of writing essays. You have a thesis, you have an argument, the argument's deductively valid, given the particular logic, you defend your premises, you reply to objections, right? And so when they engage in this, and we take sometimes a week or two to go through exactly how analytic philosophers put together the logic of their essay, they see how tough it is. And they get this stereotype out their head that philosophy is just about, expressing your opinion. That's never what it's been about. It's about defending your opinion also. And so they get in the habit of thinking much more critically than when they came into the course, which usually leads to some kind of growth, some kind of change of their beliefs. And if they happen to sway in one direction at the end of the day, there's something called truth, right? It's not like, in the biology department, it's, we're going to teach creationism and evolution equally, because diversity of ideas. No, right? So at some point, right, there's a convergence using sort of rigorous argument styles on what we might call truth, and that's the goal for me.
If I could address it in terms, sometimes I think that what I teach students or what I want to teach students is what are some good questions to ask. I mean, even today I said, what are the key questions? So I feel like I don't provide a sort of set of facts or parameters that define the world, but that I do provide perspectives that can permit them to have new questions throughout their lives. We intersect with these undergraduates for a fairly short period at a critical moment in their intellectual development, and it's not that they're going to walk away with everything we said imprinted in their brain. Would that they will, but they won't. And so what do you give them so that 20 years from now they have a set of questions or perspectives? And it's exactly what Kwaishan is talking about. It's not a set of received truths. It's a set of what do you need to understand about the world to move forward productively? And that's what I hope we give them. And understanding these questions about social order and hierarchy is an important part of surviving in today's world. I can't tell them how to think, but I can give them tools. That's how I feel. I can give them some ways of seeing that permit them to see more. That's what a great teacher does.
So I don't want to steal the show if anybody else has a question, but I'm glad you circled back, both of you, with that, because I'm not going to point her out, but when he asked the question, I heard someone say, so what is true? And so I think you kind of addressed it, truth versus fact versus tools, all the same but different, subtly different.
And whoever said what is true, you should sign up for a philosophy course. We have space.
Because they study that all the time.
Yeah, it's an advanced topic in philosophy. All right, I think we have time maybe for only one more question. I'm going to take this one right here.
So in racial and ethnic studies, arguably we still have a long ways to go. But in talking about these racialized subjects, I think the group of people that often gets left out or whose research is most undeveloped are multiracial subjects. Can you talk a little bit about how we can approach multiracial subjects when we have very little literary scholarship or information out there published to discuss, and how we can approach that when these people are often dealing with multifaceted identities?
I think that that's a really great and important question. And it goes back to the previous question, which is what are we doing in the classroom? I think some of it literally is just about equipping students with history and proper histories, which is to say a lot of the racial discourse that frames the US is very much about the peculiar institution, American exceptionalism, the transatlantic slave trade. But what I was really impressed with on the panel was how global and comparative everybody's comments were, from Quayshawn's I started 1684 to kind of the global aspect that both Susan and Sebastian have. A few years ago, a bunch of colleagues in my department and I did a Mellon Sawyer seminar called Race Across Time and Space. And the idea was that even if in the US we have this received notion of race as the peculiar institution, as the transatlantic, as a slave trade, all of those paradigms have prior histories. And so this course really became a study of all of those histories, and we relied on the intelligence of pre-modern scholars. And one example, or one unit that was just so key, was the long history of race and caste. Right, that when you look at race and caste, you cannot go to Anglo, you have to go to Spanish and Portuguese colonialism. Portugal, a sea empire, took the notion of race and caste to Goa. It went into India. It became a system of social subordination around anthropologically endogamy. Right, in India under British colonialism, Spain took race and caste to the Americas, to Latin America and Central America, where it became mixing and mestizaje and multiculturalism, or multiple identities in the way that you were talking about it, Lindsay. And so here, anthropologically, race and caste was not endogamous, it was exogamous, right? That story is the one against the one-drop rule that Susan was bringing up. In the US, because of Anglo-colonialism, because of that peculiar history, the polarized race relations are black and white. In Latin America, the polarized race relations are white and indigenous. And everything in between is mixed, and you do not have the one-drop rule. So, I mean, part of, quote unquote, the truth is just actually understanding that there are these multiple and different histories, and that a lot of us actually have not been able to access those histories precisely because they're not taught.
We're out of time. I think that's a really strong note to finish with. If you have questions, I think maybe our participants could take a couple of questions down here. Let's thank David Heng, Quayshawn Spencer, Susan Lindy, and Sebastian Huriano.